Tell me you don't feel this, and I'll walk away forever.
The moonlight catches the silk of her gown as she backs away. Her heart is racing. "You shouldn't be here, Your Grace," Savitri whispers, but her trembling voice betrays her. Duke Kairav steps closer, his jaw tight, his eyes dark as storm clouds. "And yet, here I stand, and here you remain." She turns to run. He catches her wrist. "Tell me you don't feel this," he demands, "and I'll walk away forever." But Savitri doesn't speak. Instead, she looks back, and in that split second, his lips find hers. The kiss is forbidden, dangerous, everything a duke should never do with a virgin bride promised to another man. When they part, breathless, both know the truth. They've just sealed a fate that will either destroy them or save them. But what happens when the man she was supposed to marry finds out? What price will Kairav pay for betraying the code of honor? And will their love survive the scandal that's about to explode across London? You won't believe what happens next. Don't miss a single moment of their story. Subscribe now and hit the notification bell so you never miss an episode of forbidden passion, dangerous secrets, and a love that defies everything. 3 weeks before that kiss, Savitri stood in her father's study while he signed away her future. She wasn't supposed to be there. Unmarried girls of good family didn't witness marriage negotiations, didn't watch their lives become transactions written in black ink. But she'd cracked the door open just enough to see her father's hand shaking as he pressed the seal to the contract. She'd seen him wince, the way a man does when he's made a choice he can't unmake. The Duke of Kairav wanted her, not for love. Nobody expected love in arrangements like this. He wanted her because she was beautiful, in that delicate, obedient way that satisfied a man's pride. Because her bloodline was acceptable. Because at 23, with her first bloom already fading, she was running out of chances, and her father was running out of money. She learned these things not from her father, but from the whispers of servants, from her mother's tight smile, from the way people's eyes changed when they looked at her now. From the moment the announcement was made, Savitri became not a person, but a prize. A future duchess, a prize that had been claimed. Her days became a careful choreography of preparation. New gowns arrived in trunks lined with silver paper. Her mother taught her what a duchess must know. Which fork to use, which words to avoid, how to sit so her posture pleased the eye, how to be so perfectly composed that you disappear into the role entirely, how to want nothing, how to need nothing, how to become nothing but what a man requires of you. The strangest part was how little she knew about him. Kairav Rathod existed in London society as a legend before he existed as a man. 32 years old, wickedly handsome, the papers said, dangerously clever. A widower whose first wife had died in childbirth 6 years ago, along with their son. Since then, he'd isolated himself in that great estate on the Thames, emerging only for matters of parliament and apparently to acquire a new bride. Everyone agreed he was a catch. Everyone also agreed he was dangerous. There was something too controlled about him, too calculating. Men like that, her mother warned, don't marry for sentiment. They marry for legacy. They marry for heirs. The thought made Savitri's stomach turn. 2 days before her wedding, she walked through the gardens behind her father's house and found something that shouldn't exist. A moment of solitude. She sat by the fountain where the water moved constantly. Never still, never the same, always going somewhere. She understood the water better than she understood herself. That's when she heard the horse. He rode through the gardens like he owned them, which technically She realized he soon would. Everything about Kairav Rathod moved with intention. The way he held the reins, the way he dismounted, the way his eyes found her sitting by the fountain, her wedding dress still packed away, her real self still briefly visible. For a moment, neither of them moved. "You're trespassing," she said, because it was the only thing she could think to say. He smiled, and it was nothing like the courteous expression she'd seen in the parlor when he'd been introduced to her formally. This smile had teeth. "So are you. I live here. For 2 more days." He moved closer. "After that, you're mine." Your father made that rather official. The way he said it should have frightened her. It did frighten her, but it also made her feel alive in a way she hadn't since she was a child, before the weight of expectation learned to sit on her shoulders. Before she learned to make herself small. "Do you even know my name?" The question escaped before she could stop it. He stopped walking. His eyes locked onto hers, and something shifted in his face. Something genuine cracked through the controlled exterior. "Savitri," he said, testing the word like it meant something. "It means friend of the sun." No one had ever said her name like that before. Like it mattered. Like it was something more than just a sound. And that's when she understood. This man was going to destroy her in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The wedding night arrived like an execution. Savitri sat in Kairav's London townhouse wearing a nightgown so fine it felt like wearing nothing at all. The servants had bathed her in rosewater and left her alone in a room she'd never seen before, on a bed that was not hers, waiting for a man she'd spoken to only twice in her life. The weight of tradition pressed down on her like a stone. Everyone knew what happened on wedding nights. Everyone pretended not to know. Everyone expected everything to be different tomorrow because a priest had spoken words over their heads. She heard his footsteps before she saw him. Kairav entered without knocking, still half-dressed from the reception, his collar undone, his dark hair falling across his forehead. He looked different when he wasn't performing. Harder, older, like a man carrying something he'd been taught never to put down. "You're terrified," he said. It wasn't a question. "I'm not supposed to be." She kept her hands folded in her lap, her voice small. He moved to the window, instead of toward the bed. He poured himself a drink from a decanter, with deliberate slowness, as though giving both of them time to breathe, as though this was something he needed to think about carefully. "Your father told me something today," he said, without turning around. Something he said I should know before consummating this marriage. Savitri's heart seized. Consummating. The word hung in the air like a curse. "What did he tell you?" "That you were promised to someone else 3 years ago." Before his circumstances changed, the room tilted. She had been promised to someone else. The arrangement had fallen through when her father's business collapsed, when suddenly what had been promised was no longer valuable enough to keep. She'd been 16 then, ashamed, relieved, trapped between both emotions at once. "It was over," she whispered. "It was ended before I even understood it had begun. But you remember him." Kairav finally turned to face her. His eyes were like flint. "Your father sees it written on your face. He asked me to ensure you understand that your past no longer belongs to you. That everything you are now belongs to me." Something cracked inside her chest, not from fear, but from fury. She stood, and the nightgown fell around her like a ghost. "My past doesn't belong to anyone. It's mine. It's the only thing that is." Kairav stared at her. For a long moment, he simply looked at her standing there, defiant and terrified and angry all at once. Then he did something unexpected. He laughed. Not a cruel laugh, but something that sounded almost like recognition. "God help me," he said quietly. He set down his drink and crossed the room toward her. Savitri's breath stopped. This was the moment. This was when she would become a wife in the fullest sense, when her body would no longer be entirely her own, when the choice would be taken from her permanently. But he didn't touch her that way. Instead, he took her face in his hands, and he kissed her forehead, just the forehead, soft and careful, like she was something precious and fragile. "I won't take what isn't freely given," he said against her hair. "That's not who I am, no matter what your father believes, no matter what this marriage requires." Savitri didn't know whether to believe him. She wanted to. That want was dangerous. She could feel it spreading through her like poison, like something beautiful and deadly all at once. "Then why did you marry me?" The question came out broken. He pulled back just enough to look at her. His jaw was clenched, his eyes carrying something dark and unspoken. "Because I needed to marry someone, and when I saw you in that garden, I thought perhaps it could be different with you. I thought perhaps I could find something real instead of just performing the role. I was wrong to bring you into this. I see that now." "Into what?" She reached up before she could stop herself, her fingers touching his face. He was real. He was flesh and bone and breath, not the legend she'd imagined. "What are you carrying that's so heavy?" He caught her wrist, not roughly, but with enough force to make her understand he was holding himself back from something. "There is a reason I've been alone for 6 years. There is a reason I married a woman I barely know, instead of choosing from the eligible women of London who would have thrown themselves at my title. There is a force at work in my life that I haven't told anyone about, not because I'm noble enough to protect them, but because I'm coward enough to want to keep it secret." Her pulse hammered beneath his touch. "Tell me." "Not tonight, please, not tonight." He released her and stepped back, creating distance between them again. "Tonight, we'll sleep. Tomorrow, we'll begin the work of understanding who we've become. But not tonight. Tonight, I need you to know that I'm not the man your father sold you to. I'm something far more complicated and infinitely more dangerous." He took a blanket from a chair and moved toward the door, and in that moment, Savitri understood that she'd already made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She didn't know what Kairav was carrying, but she would spend her life finding out. She would spend her life peeling back the layers of his control, searching for the man beneath, and in doing so, she would unearth things about herself she'd never known existed. She reached out and called his name into the darkness. "Kairav." He stopped at the threshold, and when he turned back to her, she saw it clearly, for the first time. He was afraid, not of her, but of what she represented. A chance at something real, a woman who might see through his armor and destroy him with what she found. "Yes?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Whatever you're carrying," she said, "I want to understand it. I want to understand you." He didn't respond. He simply closed the door and left her alone in the darkness, with a truth that terrified her. She was no longer marrying a duke out of duty. She was beginning to want him, and wanting anything in a life built on obedience was the most dangerous thing she could possibly do. The next morning, Savitri woke alone. The space beside her was cold, untouched. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and let herself feel something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. Longing, not for duty, not for security, but for a person. She didn't see Kairav until evening. He was in the study when she found him, surrounded by papers and ledgers, the kind of work a man does when he's trying to outrun his own thoughts. He looked like he hadn't slept. His shirt was unbuttoned at the collar, his hair disheveled, his eyes carrying that particular exhaustion that comes from fighting something internally. "We need to establish boundaries," he said, before she could speak. "Society will expect us to present ourselves as a couple at functions. We'll do that. We'll be cordial. We'll play the roles we're meant to play. But in private, there needs to be distance." She watched him shuffle through papers without really seeing them. This was the armor coming back into place. This was him building walls before she could climb them. Why? She moved closer, and she saw him tense. Why the distance, if you told me you wanted something real? Because real is a luxury we can't afford. His voice was sharp, the words cutting. Because there are things happening in this household that you're better off not knowing about. Because every moment you spend trying to understand me is a moment you're putting yourself in danger. Danger from what? He finally looked at her, and his eyes were storm dark. From me. From my enemies. From the very real possibility that this marriage was a mistake from the beginning, and that by allowing you close to me, I'm condemning you to a life you didn't consent to. Savitri felt something shift inside her. Not fear, determination. All her life, people had made choices for her, and she'd accepted them because she didn't know there was another option. Because she'd been trained to be grateful for whatever fate delivered. But standing in that study, looking at a man who was trying to protect her by pushing her away, she understood something crucial. She was no longer a girl waiting for life to happen to her. She was a woman, and she had choices. I consent to this, she said quietly. Whatever this is, I consent. He shook his head violently. You don't understand what you're consenting to. Then teach me. Before he could respond, a knock came at the study door. Kairav's entire body went rigid. Savitri had never seen fear move through a man so completely. He stood, straightening his clothes with quick, mechanical movements, becoming the Duke again instead of the frightened man she'd glimpsed. Come in, he said, his voice steady as stone. The man who entered was older, perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark hair and eyes that held the weight of old secrets. He wore the insignia of a member of parliament and carried himself with the confidence of someone accustomed to moving through the highest circles of power. Kairav, the man said, barely acknowledging Savitri's presence. We need to discuss the matter we spoke about. Your wife's presence complicates things. Kairav stepped forward, placing himself deliberately between Savitri and the visitor. Anything you have to say to me can be said in front of my wife. The man's eyes flickered toward her, and she saw something calculating move behind them, something cold. I wouldn't advise that course of action. The less she knows, the safer she is. Surely you've explained that to her. Leave, Kairav said. You're making a mistake that will cost you everything. The agreement was clear. The agreement, Kairav said, his voice dropping to something lethal, was made before I married. I'm releasing myself from it. The man smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing Savitri had ever seen. A smile without warmth, without anything human behind it. You can't release yourself from something that's already embedded in your name, your title, your very survival. You know what they found when they dug up the East Garden at Thornfield 3 years ago? Kairav's jaw clenched so hard she thought it might break. Get out of my house. They found what's left of your first wife, Kairav, or rather, what was left after you decided she knew too much, after you decided she couldn't be trusted to keep the secret. The world stopped. Savitri felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. The man was saying something unspeakable, accusing Kairav of something so dark it seemed impossible. And yet, Kairav's response wasn't denial. It was rage. Pure, animal rage. He moved toward the man, with such violence that Savitri actually stepped back. But before he reached him, Kairav stopped himself. He stood there, trembling, caught between the man he wanted to be and the man he was being accused of being. My wife's death was ruled an accident, Kairav said through gritted teeth. Complications from childbirth. That was the truth then, and it remains the truth. The truth is, whatever we decide it is. The man straightened his jacket. You're going to continue our arrangement, Kairav. You're going to do exactly what you've been doing. And if you refuse, if you try to step out of line again, your new wife will learn precisely what kind of man she's married to. Whether that's the truth or merely a convenient fiction depends entirely on your cooperation." He left, and the door closed behind him with the finality of a coffin lid. Savitri stood frozen in the sudden silence. Kairav had his back to her, his shoulders heaving, his hands clenched into fists. She wanted to speak. She wanted to ask. She wanted to know whether what she'd just heard was true or manipulation. But most of all, she wanted to understand why he was standing there like a man drowning, while the shore remained just out of reach. "Kairav," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and she barely recognized him. His face was raw with emotion, stripped of all pretense. "Now you know," he said. "Now you understand why I tried to keep you away, why distance was the only thing I could offer you that was merciful. What is he forcing you to do? Something that will destroy us both if you stay close to me." She crossed the space between them and took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I'm not afraid of being destroyed. I'm afraid of living half a life. I'm afraid of being married to a ghost. Whatever this is, whatever you're being forced to do, we face it together now. Not because I'm noble, but because I've already made my choice, and it's you." He kissed her then, fierce and desperate and broken. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her close like she was the only solid thing in a world that was collapsing. It was a kiss that tasted like fear and hope mixed together, like a man grabbing hold of something before he went under. When they broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "If I tell you," he said against her mouth, "there's no going back. You'll be complicit in things that could hang us both. Then tell me," she whispered. "Whatever it is, I want to know who I'm married to. The real man. Not the Duke, not the legend. You." He pulled back and looked at her for a long moment. Then he made a choice. He decided to trust her, to believe that she meant what she said, to take the risk that loving someone meant giving them the power to destroy you. "Not here," he said. "There are ears in every corner of this house. Tomorrow night, there's a place I know. Meet me at the fountain in the garden at midnight." "The fountain where you found me," she said. "Yes, where I first saw you as something other than a transaction. Where I first realized I'd made a terrible mistake in marrying you." "A mistake?" She framed his face with her hands, forcing him to hold her gaze. "You're going to have to explain that." "A mistake? Because it means I'm capable of love, and loving you will be the most dangerous thing I've ever done." He kissed her forehead, her cheeks, her lips. "Midnight, Savitri. Wear dark clothes. And if you change your mind, if you decide you'd rather not know, I'll understand. I'll let you go." But they both knew she wouldn't change her mind. They both knew that she'd already crossed into territory from which there was no return. Love wasn't a choice anymore. It was a current she'd stepped into, and it was pulling her deeper into waters that grew darker with every passing moment. Midnight arrived like a held breath. Savitri slipped through the corridors of the townhouse in dark clothes, her heart hammering so violently she thought surely someone would hear it and discover her. The servants were asleep. The house was silent, except for the ticking of clocks and the whisper of wind against the windows. She moved like a ghost through rooms she was learning to hate, rooms that kept secrets the way a tomb keeps bones. The garden was silver with moonlight. The fountain stood in the center like a heart still beating, water catching the light and throwing it back to the sky. Kairav was already there, and he wasn't alone. There was a woman with him. Young, perhaps 20, with eyes that held the particular desperation of someone who'd been pushed into a corner with no way out. She wore a servant's dress that didn't quite fit properly, and her hands were trembling. "This is Eleanor," Kairav said without preamble. She was a maid at Thornfield before my wife died. She's the only living witness to what really happened that night." Savitri looked between them, trying to understand the shape of this confession. What did happen? Eleanor's voice was small, fractured with fear. "Your husband's first wife, Lady Catherine. She found something she shouldn't have. Documents in the study. She read them and realized that her husband was being used by men in Parliament to facilitate something illegal. She wanted to go to the authorities. What were they using me to facilitate?" Kairav asked, though it seemed he already knew the answer. The question was for Savitri. Eleanor took a breath. Trafficking. The smuggling of vulnerable women from India and other colonies into England. They were being brought in under the guise of domestic servants, and they were being sold to wealthy men. Your husband was providing access to his properties, his ships, his reputation. The words hung in the air like poison gas. Savitri felt her lungs contract. This was what the man from Parliament had meant. This was the darkness Kairav had been carrying. "I didn't know," Kairav said, and his voice was hollow. "Not at first. They told me I was facilitating trade agreements. By the time I understood what was actually happening, it was too late. They had leverage, photographs, forged documents that made it look like I was the orchestrator. They said if I tried to stop them, if I went to the authorities, I would hang for crimes I didn't commit." "But you stayed silent," Savitri said, "not as an accusation, but as a statement of fact." "You stayed silent while women suffered." "Yes." He didn't flinch from it. "I was a coward. I chose my life over theirs, and I will carry that shame until I die." Eleanor continued, her voice stronger now. Lady Catherine wanted to stop it. She said she didn't care if it meant her husband was implicated. She was going to tell someone. The night she died, your husband tried to convince her not to. They argued, and then she paused, and tears slipped down her cheeks. And then one of the men they worked with came to the house. He told her she was making a mistake, that some secrets were too big to expose, that some people were too powerful to fight. What did he do? Savitri's voice was barely a whisper. "He gave her a choice," Eleanor said. "Keep quiet, disappear, live in exile, or he would make sure she disappeared permanently." She refused to choose either option. She said she would rather die than be complicit in such evil. So he made sure she got her wish. The words landed like stones in still water. Everything Kairav had told her about his wife's death had been a lie, not because he was guilty of murder, but because he was guilty of something equally damning, letting her die when he might have prevented it. "Why didn't you go to the authorities after?" Savitri demanded. "Why didn't you expose them?" "Because they promised me they would ensure I was framed for her death. They said the evidence was damning. They said that if I opened my mouth, I would swing alongside the men I accused, and I was a coward." "I still am." A sound came from the house. Footsteps, male voices. The man from Parliament had arrived with others, and they were searching. They'd discovered the three of them were missing. "We have minutes," Eleanor said urgently. "Maybe less. They know I'm talking. They know I've come to you with the truth." "They're not going to let that stand." Kairav grabbed Savitri's hand. "We leave. Now. Eleanor knows people in the network. Women who've escaped. We go to the authorities with her testimony, and we expose everything. It will destroy me. I'll lose my title, my estate, everything. But we stop them." "They'll kill us," Eleanor said flatly. "As soon as we go public, we're dead. They've already arranged it. There's a ship leaving at dawn. I was supposed to help a group of women get aboard as free passengers. They're going to ensure that ship sinks in the channel, with all of us on it." Savitri's mind raced. She understood then the full weight of the choice before them. They could run. They could try to hide, to live outside of society, always looking over their shoulders. Or they could stand and fight, knowing that death was the likely outcome. "There's another way," Savitri said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "You have leverage. These men, they're parliamentarians. They have reputations. They have power, because people believe them to be respectable. What if we didn't go to the authorities? What if we went to the press? What if we made this impossible to keep secret?" "They'll deny everything," Eleanor said. "It will be our word against theirs." "Not if we have documentation," Savitri said. And as she spoke, she understood what she was proposing. A risk that would make her complicit in Kairov's crimes, even though he'd committed them under duress. A betrayal of her own safety, a sacrifice that couldn't be taken back. "The documents your first wife found, where are they?" Kairov's eyes widened. "In the study at Thornfield, locked in a safe behind a painting." "Then we get them. We get Eleanor's testimony in writing. We get everything, and we send it to every newspaper in London simultaneously. Make it too public to cover up. Make it too widespread to contain." "That would take days," Eleanor said. "We don't have days." "Then we make the time." Savitri pulled her hand from Kairov's. "You two go. Take the ship if you have to. Get to safety. I'll stay here and maintain appearances. I'll gather the documents from Thornfield. I'll get Eleanor's statement written down and hidden where they can't find it. And when you reach the continent, I'll send it all at once. They won't be able to touch you if you're already gone." "No," Kairov said immediately. "Absolutely not. They know you were with me. They'll suspect you. They'll hurt you to get to me." "Probably," Savitri agreed. "But if we all run together, if we're all visible, they'll catch us before we leave the country. This way, I'm still here, playing the role of the dutiful Duchess. I'm still under their control, which means they believe they still have leverage. It gives you time." The footsteps were getting closer. They could hear voices now, calling their names into the darkness. "I won't leave you," Kairov said, and she could hear the desperation breaking through his control. "I won't make another choice that sacrifices someone I love for my own survival." "Then love me enough to let me do this," Savitri said. She pulled his face down to hers and kissed him with everything she had, everything she was. It tasted like goodbye and hello, like an ending and a beginning. "Love me enough to understand that I'm not helpless. I'm not a victim. I'm choosing this. I'm choosing to fight. I'm choosing to save you. Savitri, go," she whispered against his mouth. "Please, before they get here." Eleanor grabbed his arm. "She's right. We have to move. Now." The footsteps were almost upon them. Kairov looked at Savitri one final time, and she saw everything he felt written on his face. Fear, love, desperation, gratitude, guilt. Then he ran, pulling Eleanor with him, disappearing into the shadows of the garden like a ghost dissolving into night. Savitri stood alone by the fountain and waited for the men to find her. When they did, she smiled the smile of the dutiful Duchess, confused and innocent. "I came out for air," she said calmly. "I couldn't sleep. The Duke is likely in the library. He works such late hours." They believed her. Of course they believed her. She was a woman, and women had never been taught to be threatening. But as they escorted her back inside, Savitri understood something profound. She had just placed herself in the hands of people who would kill her without hesitation if they discovered what she was planning. She had just chosen a fate that could end in her death. And the strangest thing was that she didn't regret it. For the first time in her life, she was exercising real power, the power to choose, the power to sacrifice, the power to save someone she loved by risking everything. The next morning, she would smile and play her part. She would gather the documents. She would take Eleanor's statement in secret. She would do what needed to be done, knowing that every moment she was running out of time, that death was closer than her next breath. But tonight, in the darkness of her chamber, she placed her hand over her heart and promised herself something. She would survive this. She would see Kairav again on the continent. They would live to build something new, something real, something born from the ashes of their former lives. And she would never, ever apologize for the woman she'd become. 3 days. That's all the time it took for Savitri to understand that living a lie while surrounded by enemies was far more exhausting than any physical torture could be. She moved through Thornfield Manor like a woman sleepwalking, playing the part of the concerned wife, telling anyone who asked that the Duke had business on the continent and would return shortly. She smiled when she was expected to smile. She attended tea with the wives of Parliament members, listening to their vacant gossip while her hands trembled beneath the table. Every moment felt like standing on the edge of a knife, knowing that one misstep would send her tumbling. The safe behind the painting in Kairav's study yielded its secrets without resistance. She'd found the combination, written in his personal ledger, hidden among pages of guilt and self-recrimination. The documents inside were damning: names, dates, ship manifests listing women brought into England under false pretenses, bank transfers showing payments made to men in positions of power, photographs of women who looked hollow-eyed and broken, their humanity traded away for profit. She sat in that study late at night, copying everything by candlelight, her hand cramping from the effort. Each document she transcribed was a nail in her own coffin. Each name she recorded was a target on her back. And still, she continued. Eleanor's written testimony arrived hidden in a package, addressed to a fictional cousin, delivered by a street child who'd been paid by contacts Eleanor had established in London years ago. The testimony was meticulous and devastating. It detailed not just what Eleanor had witnessed, but the system itself, how the trafficking network operated, who was involved, how much money changed hands, how many women had passed through their operation. Savitri kept everything hidden in the lining of her winter cloak, sewn there with shaking fingers and a needle that felt like a weapon in her hands. On the 4th night, the man from Parliament came to see her. He found her in the drawing room, and his presence sucked the oxygen from the air. He was polite about it, which was somehow worse than if he'd been cruel. He asked about her health. He asked if she was enjoying the estate. He asked if she'd heard from her husband recently. She lied, with a composure that would have terrified her if she'd had the luxury of fear. The Duke was handling business matters. She expected him to return within the week. She was content to wait for him here, maintaining the household. "You're a remarkable woman," he said, settling into a chair across from her. "Your husband is fortunate to have found someone so accepting of his circumstances." "My husband is fortunate to be married at all," Savitri replied, keeping her voice light. "Most women would not tolerate his frequent absences. Indeed, most women would ask questions." He leaned forward slightly, and she could see the predator moving beneath his civilized exterior. "You don't ask questions, do you, Lady Kairav? You don't wonder what he's been doing. You don't demand to know where he's gone. I've learned that some things are better left unknown." A wise philosophy. He stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the garden where she'd made her choice 4 nights ago. "Your husband was supposed to ensure that certain matters remained undiscussed. He was supposed to continue his cooperation with our organization. Instead, he ran. He took our only witness with him. And now, I'm left wondering if perhaps his wife knows something about his plans." Savitri's heart was hammering so hard she thought it would break through her ribs. "I know nothing about any plans. My husband told me he needed to attend to business. He left. That's all I know." "You see," he said, turning back to face her, "that's the problem. I believe you, actually, which means that the documents are still here." The documents that my associates tell me your husband attempted to steal from the safe. The documents that could prove rather inconvenient for all of us. He didn't search, he didn't threaten. He simply sat with her for another hour, asking questions about her childhood, her life before marriage, her feelings about London society. He was hunting for weaknesses. He was testing to see if she would break under the weight of his presence. By the time he left, Savitri was shaking so badly she had to grip the arms of her chair to remain upright. He knew. He didn't know everything, but he suspected. He was tightening his noose, and she could feel it closing around her neck. She sent word through Eleanor's network that night. The documents needed to go out. It was time. The editors of the Times, the Morning Chronicle, and the Gazette each received an identical package containing copies of everything: testimonies, documents, names, a signed letter from Savitri herself, admitting that the Duke had fled the country rather than face justice, but that she was staying to ensure the truth was known. By morning, the story would be everywhere. By tomorrow, Parliament would be in chaos. That night, she packed a single bag and left the house through the garden, the same fountain where she'd made her choice burning in her memory like a beacon. She didn't go far, just to a small inn in the village, where she took a room under an assumed name and waited. By noon the next day, the newspapers were on the streets. The headlines screamed like accusations. Prominent members of Parliament accused of trafficking. Documents reveal systematic exploitation. Duchess provides evidence from safety of continent. The lie she'd told worked perfectly. Everyone assumed Kairav had orchestrated the release. Everyone assumed Savitri was with him, safe, out of reach. No one realized she was sitting in a shabby inn room in Surrey, waiting for them to come for her. They came at sunset. The man from Parliament arrived with 3 others, and they didn't bother with civility this time. They kicked down the door to her room, and when she stood to face them, she saw death move behind their eyes. "You've destroyed us," he said simply. "Everything we built, everything we controlled, gone. Because of you." "Because of what you were doing," Savitri corrected, and her voice was steady. "I simply showed the world what you were hiding." He raised his hand to strike her, and that's when the constables arrived. They poured through the hallway in a flood of authority, and suddenly the room was chaos. The man from Parliament was being arrested. His associates were being restrained. Everything was collapsing into justice. But it was Eleanor who'd summoned them. Eleanor, who'd never left London at all. Eleanor, who'd been working with magistrates who weren't corrupted, who'd been gathering her own evidence, who'd been waiting for Savitri to make her move so they could move in coordination. As the constables led the men away, Eleanor stepped into the room, and Savitri's breath caught. Eleanor was alive. Eleanor was safe. Eleanor was smiling. "Your husband wanted to come back for you," Eleanor said. "He's been going mad on the continent, thinking about you every moment. But I told him I would come. I told him I would make sure you were protected until the dust settled." "How long?" Savitri asked. "How long until the trials? Until they're convicted? Months, probably. But the tide has turned. The newspapers have done what we couldn't do alone. They've made it impossible to deny. Parliament is fracturing over this. Some of these men are already trying to flee the country. Others are turning on each other to save themselves. And the women," Savitri's voice was small. "The ones who were trafficked, where are they? Safe houses. We've been building them for years, even before you and the Duke joined the fight. There are places for them now, places where they can begin again, if they choose to." The enormity of it overwhelmed her. She'd expected to die. Instead, she'd lived to see something good begin to grow from the ashes of her choices. It took 6 weeks for Kairav to return to England. 6 weeks of testimony and trials, of watching the men who'd held such power reduced to insignificance. 6 weeks of Savitri, living quietly in a small cottage, helping Eleanor establish homes for the women who'd escaped the network, doing the work that mattered. He found her in the garden of the cottage, kneeling in the dirt, planting seeds for spring flowers. When she looked up and saw him, it felt like the moment in the garden at her father's house all over again, like the moment she'd first understood that she was capable of changing her own fate. He was thinner, older, carrying new ghosts in his eyes, but he was looking at her like she was the only real thing in a world full of illusions. "You came back," she whispered. "I never left you," he said. "Not really. Every moment on the continent, I was thinking about what you were doing, what risks you were taking. How terrified I was that I'd sent you into danger. You didn't send me anywhere, I chose." He knelt beside her in the dirt, not caring about his clothes, not caring about propriety or status, or any of the things that had once mattered. "I know, and I've spent 6 weeks understanding what that choice cost you. What it cost both of us. I've spent 6 weeks understanding that I finally have something worth living for, someone worth becoming better for." She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "I'm still the same woman you married, just less afraid now." "You were never afraid," he said. "You were brave from the moment you told me you'd stay in that house and gather the evidence. You were brave every single moment after that. I was the one who was afraid. I'm still afraid. I'm afraid of disappointing you. I'm afraid of not being worthy of what you've sacrificed for me." "Then spend the rest of your life proving that you are," she said. "Not for me, for yourself, for all the women we couldn't save before, for Eleanor, for everyone who suffered because powerful men decided they could own human beings." He kissed her then, and it was different from the kiss in the study. It was calmer, deeper, like the beginning of something that would last, not the desperate grasping of two people standing on the edge of an abyss. When they broke apart, Savitri was crying, though she couldn't quite say if it was from joy or grief, or some combination of both. The old life was gone, the life of the dutiful Duchess playing a role in a house full of secrets. That woman had been burned away by fire and choice and sacrifice. What remained was something harder, something stronger. A woman who understood that love wasn't about being protected from the world. Love was about facing the world together, unflinching, and deciding to build something better from its rubble. 2 years later, the cottage had become a safe house for women escaping trafficking situations. Kairav had renounced his title and donated his estates to programs supporting survivors. Parliament had begun to reform, slowly and imperfectly, but begun nonetheless. They didn't live as Duke and Duchess anymore. They lived as Kairav and Savitri, two people who'd learned that real power wasn't in titles or estates or reputation. Real power was in the choice to love someone despite everything. Real power was in the choice to fight for something bigger than yourself. One evening, as they sat by the fountain in the garden, the same fountain where everything had changed, Savitri took Kairav's hand. "Do you regret it?" she asked. "All of it, the scandal, the loss of your title, everything you gave up?" He looked at her, and his eyes held the answer before his words could catch up. "I regret every choice I made before you. I regret every moment I was silent when I should have spoken. I regret every woman I failed to protect when I had the power to do something. But I don't regret you. I will never regret you." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and they sat there as the sun moved across the sky, painting the water gold. The fountain kept moving, never still, never the same, always going somewhere, just like Savitri had learned to do, just like love itself, never stagnant, always changing, always asking you to be brave enough to follow it wherever it led. 5 years had passed since the fountain, and the world had learned to move on. The scandal that had shaken Parliament was now history, relegated to old newspapers and dusty journals. The men responsible were either dead, imprisoned, or had fled to countries that didn't extradite. Justice had been served in the way that justice sometimes is, imperfectly, incompletely, but enough to make a difference. Savitri was no longer a duchess. She'd never wanted to be one, though it took her years to truly believe that she was free of the weight of that title. Now she was simply a woman running a network of safe houses, a woman who'd learned to listen to the stories of women who'd survived unspeakable things, a woman who understood that healing wasn't linear and that love sometimes looked like sitting with someone in silence while they learned to trust again. Kairev had found purpose in the wreckage of his former life. He worked with the magistrates, helping to reform the laws that had allowed the trafficking network to flourish for so long. He gave testimony at trials. He pushed for legislative changes that made it harder for powerful men to exploit vulnerable people. He wasn't trying to atone for his silence, though that's what Eleanor sometimes gently suggested he was doing. He was simply trying to make the world slightly less hospitable to monsters. They lived in the cottage now, a real home, in a way the estates had never been. There was a small study, where Kairev kept the letters that survivors sent him, telling him how their lives had changed. There was a garden, where Savitri grew herbs for the women at the safe houses. There was a kitchen, where they sat most mornings, drinking tea and reading the newspapers, watching for signs of progress or setbacks in the ongoing fight against exploitation. And then, one autumn morning, Eleanor arrived with news that changed everything. "There's someone asking for you," Eleanor said, and her voice carried a particular quality that made Savitri look up from her tea. "A woman. She says she knew you before. She says she needs to tell you something about your past." The woman who arrived that afternoon was older, perhaps 50, with silver running through her dark hair and eyes that held a recognition that Savitri couldn't quite place. But there was something familiar about her, something that tugged at memories Savitri had thought long buried. "My name is Priya," the woman said, and when she spoke, Savitri's breath caught. She had an accent from Western India, from the regions Savitri's mother had come from generations ago. "I worked in your father's household when you were a child. I was dismissed when you were 7 years old. Your father said I was dishonest, that I'd stolen from the family. He made sure no one would hire me after that." Savitri felt something cold move through her chest. She remembered dimly, a woman, a scandal, her father's anger, but the memory was fragmented, incomplete. "I didn't steal," Priya continued. "What I did was far more dangerous. I saw something I shouldn't have seen. I saw your father with a young girl. Not you, someone younger, and when I asked questions, when I suggested that what I'd witnessed was wrong, he destroyed my reputation to silence me. I spent the next 20 years trying to survive, trying to rebuild my life. And then I read about what you were doing, about the safe houses, about the women, and I understood that you'd become the person I wished I'd been brave enough to become." Savitri stood and walked to the window, needing distance, needing air. Her father had been part of this world. Her father had been complicit in exploitation long before he'd sold her into marriage with a man he knew was trapped in corruption. "Why are you telling me this?" Savitri asked, though she thought she already knew. "Because I've found documentation," Priya said quietly. "Papers that prove your father's involvement in the trafficking network. Not as a victim of coercion like your husband was, but as an active participant. He was one of the recruiters. He used his position as a merchant to identify vulnerable girls in India, girls from families in financial distress, and he facilitated their transport to England, and he used the money to build the life he built. Your life was purchased with the suffering of those girls. The room spun. Savitri gripped the window frame to steady herself. Her entire existence, everything she'd believed about her family, was suddenly revealed to be built on lies and atrocity. "My father is dead," Savitri said. Her voice sounded far away, like it was coming from someone else. "Yes," Priya confirmed. "He died 8 months ago, but his legacy continues. The network he helped build still exists in fragments. There are still men using his methods, still girls being brought in through routes he established." Kairav had come to stand beside Savitri at the window. She could feel his presence like a grounding force, keeping her anchored to the present moment instead of spiraling into the past. "What do you need from us?" he asked. Priya placed an envelope on the table. "I need you to do with this what you did with the other evidence. I need you to ensure that your father's name is recorded in history alongside the other criminals. I need to make sure that his complicity is known, and I need to help you find the routes he established, the safe houses he used, the men still operating in his territory. There's an entire infrastructure that was built on his work, and it's still functioning. It's still taking girls." Savitri turned from the window and looked at Priya for a long moment. This woman had kept silent for 20 years, had carried the weight of knowing and the shame of not being believed. And then she'd found courage in watching Savitri fight. "Tell us everything," Savitri said. The investigation that followed was more complex than anything that had come before. Kairav worked with magistrates in port cities, identifying ships that were using routes established by Savitri's father. Savitri worked with Eleanor to establish new safe houses in strategic locations, preparing for the women they knew would soon need rescue. Priya provided insider knowledge of the network's operations, the names of men still involved, the methods still being used. What they discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. Savitri's father had been far more than a minor player. He'd been a facilitator, a connector between the women being trafficked and the wealthy men seeking to purchase them. He'd profited enormously. His death had not diminished his legacy, it had simply made the network less efficient. But within 6 months, they had documentation that would bring down another 20 men. Within a year, the routes were disrupted. Within 2 years, Parliament had begun investigating the entire structure that Savitri's father had helped build. It should have felt like victory, and in many ways, it did. But Savitri found herself struggling with something she hadn't anticipated. The knowledge that she was the product of blood money. That the comfort of her childhood, the education she'd received, the freedom she'd been given as a child before society clamped down on her, had all been purchased with the suffering of girls just like her. She was sitting in the garden one morning, wrestling with this knowledge, when Kairav found her. "You're blaming yourself," he said. "It wasn't a question." "How can I not?" she replied. "My father was a monster. My comfortable life was built on exploitation. Every advantage I had was stolen from girls who had nothing." He sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "And what good does that guilt do? Does it change what happened? Does it save anyone?" "No," she admitted. "Then perhaps the question isn't whether you can absolve yourself of your father's sins. The question is whether you can take the guilt and transform it into something useful. Whether you can take the blood money that built your world and use it to buy freedom for the women he exploited." Savitri thought about this for a long time. The truth was, she'd already been doing that. Every safe house was funded partially by the modest inheritance her father had left her. Every woman they rescued was paid for by the wealth that had come from exploitation. She was taking the instruments of suffering and trying to transform them into instruments of healing. "I'll never know if it's enough," she said finally. You won't, Kairav agreed. But you'll know you tried. You'll know you fought. And that has to be enough. That evening, Savitri wrote a letter to be published in the newspapers. She wrote about her father's involvement in the trafficking network. She wrote about the shame of being his daughter. But most importantly, she wrote about the work still being done, the women still needing help, the network still operating in hidden places. She wrote a call to action, asking people to come forward with information, to report suspicious activity, to understand that exploitation was happening in plain sight, and that silence was complicity. The letter sparked something unexpected, a movement. Women who'd escaped came forward with their own stories. Servants in wealthy households reported suspicious activities. Sailors revealed what they'd been transporting. The scandal grew exponentially. Within 3 years, the infrastructure that Savitri's father had spent decades building had been almost completely dismantled. The girls being trafficked through the old routes found rescue instead. The men operating the network found prosecution instead of profit. Savitri stood in the Parliament gallery one afternoon, watching as new legislation was passed that would provide protections for survivors and establish official routes for women fleeing exploitation. She watched as men who'd once seemed invincible sat in the dock and faced justice. She watched as the world shifted, degree by degree, towards something more humane. Eleanor joined her in the gallery, and they sat in silence for a long time. "Do you think it's over?" Eleanor asked finally. "No," Savitri said. "I think it's just beginning. I think there will always be men who try to exploit vulnerability. I think there will always be networks in the shadows. But I think now there will also always be women fighting back. I think now there will be safe houses and advocates and people who understand that this matters. That's because of you," Eleanor said. "That's because of what you chose to do." Savitri shook her head. "That's because of all of us. That's because you were brave enough to testify. That's because Priya was brave enough to speak after 20 years of silence. That's because Priya was brave enough to stop being silent. Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from everyone deciding that something matters enough to fight for." As she said the words, Savitri understood something fundamental about herself. She was no longer the girl waiting in gardens for her life to happen. She was no longer the Duchess playing a role in someone else's story. She was a woman who'd learned that her choices mattered, that her voice had power, that love wasn't something passive that happened to you. Love was something you built deliberately, day by day, through the choices you made and the people you fought for. That night, she and Kairav sat by the fountain once again. The garden was dark, lit only by stars, and the memory of all that had transpired. "I've been thinking about something," Kairav said, "about what comes next." "What do you mean?" Savitri asked. "I mean that we've spent years fighting a system in England, but the system is global. The trafficking network extends beyond our borders. There are girls being exploited in India, in other colonies, in countries we haven't even begun to touch. I've been contacted by magistrates in India, asking if we'd be willing to extend our work there, to establish networks, to train others to do what we've been doing." Savitri felt something shift inside her. A new beginning, a new fight, a new chapter in a story that wasn't ending anytime soon. "Are you asking if I want to go back?" she asked softly. "I'm asking if you're willing to take this work home, to the place where it started, to the place where so many of these women came from." She thought about her mother's accent, about the women she'd spoken to in the safe houses, who talked about the girls left behind in villages, in cities, in places where exploitation was woven into the fabric of daily life. She thought about Priya, about all the women whose stories had never been heard because there was no one to listen. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I'll go. Thank you for watching. Thank you for believing in Savitri's story. Thank you for being part of this journey. Now, hit that subscribe button and let's change the world together.